Want a festive way to protect your tabletops this holiday season? These cutout coasters are both fun and functional. Hi, I'm Christina, and I love to digitally pattern draft, creating some unique pieces of wearable art. And sometimes some housewares and accessories, a little bit of everything. Today we're going to be making some holiday themed fabric coasters to add that festive touch to any space. With cutout designs featuring a stocking, a present, a candy cane, and a tree, these coasters are a creative way to bring holiday spirit into your home. So let's jump in and sew these charming, easy to make coasters together. Let's go. The first thing we're going to need to do is actually cut everything out. So I'm going to be using some tracing paper and a tracing wheel. I'm going to first start by actually pinning my pattern down so that it doesn't move. Then I'm going to trace out the cut line. I'm not going to worry about the stitch line for this one, except on each one of the objects. So each one of the objects, I want to really dig in there and make sure that that pattern is transferred onto the fabric so it's easy to then stitch on. Once I have started with the stocking, the tracing paper might be a little old, so I'm actually just going to kind of go in, give myself some guidelines of where each of the different pieces will land. Now, each one of these is perfectly square, so one thing that I want to do is I'm just going to line up the edge of the second pattern with the edge of the first pattern. That way I don't have to have two cuts there. I can just have one cut. Then I'm going to go ahead and trace around the rest of it and then trace the candy cane out. If you're looking for this tracing paper or want to know a little bit more about it, you can definitely find it up here and check out this video to learn where you can buy it and why I love it so much. If you're also interested in this tracing wheel, you can find a review on it here, and I highly, highly recommend this tracing wheel because it has multiple different heads that you can then use. So again, I lined up my pattern with the edge of the other pattern so I wouldn't have to have two cuts but only one. Then I went through and I traced around each one of the shapes. So I have a candy cane, a stocking, a present, and finally a tree. There we go. Now that I have that cut out, I'm going to layer on top of all the different layers that I need. So I'm going to need the two front layers that I'm going to be bagging out and the back layer. So I need a total of 3 layers right here. So I'm just going to pin it so that it's there, and then I can cut all 3 squares out for every single one at the same time. You don't have to do it this way. You can trace the outline of just the stitch line on each layer if you so choose, but I wanted to go as quick as possible. So I went ahead and layered them all up, pinned them together, and now I'm cutting them out. Next, it is time to actually cut out the fabric that will create all the different backgrounds. And I'm just going to use a whole bunch of scraps I have lying around. And I'm going to be cutting out the size of fabric that I need. So for the candy cane, I'm going to cut half this mask apart. For the stocking, I'm not 100% sure what part of this fabric I'm going to want the stocking to land on. So I'm going to want to make that decision later. So I'm going to cut a much bigger square so that I have a lot of options. And then for the present, I'm just going to cut yet another square. Now, we're going to go ahead and put these coasters together one by one, starting with the present. So I'm going to start with right sides together of the 2 fabrics that are going to be the face of the pattern. This is also the same fabric that I traced the actual shape on. I am then going to stitch around, being very careful around each one of those corners, back stitching on each of the corners, and creating the shape of the present in stitching form. Then I'm going to actually trim away everything that I don't need. I also want to trim into the corners so that I have a really nice crisp corner on every single one of those corners. With this present, there's lots of little corners you have to get into. So you want to make sure that you're trimming everything and clipping those corners away before you're flipping. Make sure you clip through or to and not through, or else you're gonna probably have to start over. Then I'm just going to flip it right side out, use my point turner a little bit to really get that pointed to those points crisp. Then I'm going to move over to the iron, and I'm going to iron open every single one of those seams as best I can. And that will help the present turn right side out. Once I have it pretty well turned right side out, I'm going to use the iron again to really crisp up that present shape with these two fabric pieces there. Then I'm going to move back over to my sewing machine, and I'm going to place my present using that background. Now, if you want to change where that background's being held or what's being seen, this is the time to do it. I also decided I wanted to add some cute little ribbon so it looks like there was an actual tie happening on my present. So if you're adding those in, make sure that you pin them down well so that they don't move when you are actually sewing them together. Now that I'm happy with the look, I'm going to stitch all the way around my present. I want to have an even stitch all the way around, so I'm just using a guide on my sewing machine foot to ensure that all the way around is an even away stitch. This is also stitching down the ribbon at this time. And then I'm going to backstitch at the beginning and end. I'm going to trim the excess of this fabric away so that it doesn't accidentally get caught in another seam or add too much bulk. Now, I also am going to be adding this cute little ribbon to the very top of this. So I'm just going to take some ribbon, wrap it around my fingers a number of times, squeeze it in half, and then I'm going to stitch it right down to the top, right on top of everything. So I'm just going to sew it down, give it a nice solid stitch there. In the end, I'll be able to pull it out and make it look really cute by separating all these little guys. But I found out I did this a little bit too soon because then I kind of had to re-squish it back down so that I didn't catch it in my outer seam. So I always recommend waiting just a little bit longer before you pull your ribbons out. The next thing is we're going to put the backing fabric on. So right side to right side, we're going to place that backing fabric on. We're going to stitch all the way around my coaster here, and we want to leave about a 2-inch opening on one side. Then I'm going to go ahead and clip all those corners, move back to the iron, and press open all the seams. This will help give it a nice turn. It'll be easier to turn it. And you want to press both sides back just because it's going to help finish out the present. Once you have it fully ironed, we're going to flip it right side out, grab our point turner, give those points a nice crisp point. And then give it one more iron. You want to make sure that where your opening is, everything is nicely turned in, and make sure you get a nice good press on that. Then we're going to move back to the sewing machine and do one more final stitch all the way around all 4 sides. This is closing up the hole and making sure all the edges remain crisp. Then you're down to the detailing, pulling all those ribbons out, making it look really nice, and you have your present coaster completed. Next, we're going to move on to the stocking coaster. It will have very similar steps with the different shape. So with right sides together of your front fabrics, you're going to stitch all the way around your object, which is the stocking. Now, with how tight these curves are, I recommend going to a much smaller stitch. If you're using a much smaller stitch, you'll be able to make those really tiny, tight curves much easier than if you're using a longer stitch. Once I have it all traced out with my stitch line, I'm going to go ahead and cut out the inside of the stocking. And then I'm also going to do just some little clips specifically into the top corners and then around those curves. Now make sure you are clipping to and not through. If you clip through, you're probably going to have to redo it. There we go. Now we have it. We're going to use that point turner and start flipping this pattern to the right side. Then we're going to move over to the ironing board and really press it in. This one was a little bit too hard to try to actually press open each one of the seams, so I was just able to kind of press it and manipulate it with my fingers to make it work. Now it's time to add that background fabric. So I'm just going to play around with the placement of what I want the stocking to look like and just test out a few different ways before I finally settle on one and see which one I like best. And I'm kind of really liking the holly right there at the top. So that's what I'm going to do. And I'm going to go ahead and just pin that in place so that it won't move on me. Move back over to my sewing machine. And then I'm going to again stitch all the way around the stocking. You want to make sure that you're stitching at the same distance apart from the edge of your fabric all the way around to make it look nice and clean and professional. And again, to get those really tight turns and everything, I highly suggest a tiny stitch. It's one of those stitches that you never want to take out. So that's how small I recommend you going, just because it will make it that much easier. Then we're going to go ahead and trim away the excess fabric so that we don't have extra bulk inside of there. Then we're going to grab our backing fabric and we're going to put right sides together and pin that together. Then we're going to stitch all the way around our 4 corners of our coaster, leaving another 2-inch opening so that we can flip it right side out. There we go. Then we're going to clip those corners off just like so. Throw those out, and then we're going to iron open the seams again. So we're going to press those seams open on one side. Flip it over and do the exact same thing again. So we're going to press back those seams. That'll make it easier to close up that hole, and it'll make it easier to make a finished, crisp looking coaster. Time to flip it right side out. Use that point turner to get all those points nice and pointy. Give it one more press, making sure that your opening is lining up really well. And then move back to that sewing machine and close it on up with a stitch all the way around, an even width away from the edge of the fabric. And there we have it. We now have our stocking coaster completed. And it's time to move on to the candy cane. So the first thing we're going to do is we are going to trace out the candy cane with our sewing machine. Remember, when you're working with those tiny, tiny curves, tiny, tiny stitches will make those curves much easier. Once it is all stitched around, it's time to cut out the center bits. Now with this candy cane curve, you want to be extra careful about how you're stitching and how you're flipping everything. So I'm just going to clip as close as possible to that. I'm not actually going to put any small slashes in. I'm just going to leave it so that it is as a nice teeny tiny seam allowance there on the inside. Then I'm going to go ahead and start flipping it to the right side. And for this one, I kind of had to use like a pencil to help get that candy cane curve kind of pushed out to the right side. Once you have it mostly pushed to the right side, we're going to go ahead and move over to the ironing board and help really crisp it up. Again, I found it very difficult to actually try to iron open each one of the seam allowances, so I just went straight to the iron and gave it a really nice press. Next, it's time to add that background fabric. So if you want to play with what directions the stripes are going or anything, this is the time to kind of twist and play. But once you're happy, pin it down and sew on that backing striped fabric to your candy cane shape. Again, remember those teeny tiny stitches will really help you get around those teeny tiny curves in a much smoother fashion. There we go. I'm then going to trim away the excess fabric so I have not as much fabric inside, causing extra bulk. And now it's time to finish the coaster. So with right sides together with the backing fabric, I'm going to pin everything in place, move back to the sewing machine, and I'm going to stitch around the 4 sides, making sure to back stitch at each of the corners, and also remembering to leave an opening about 2 inches wide so that I can flip the coaster to the right side. Once that's done, it's time to clip those corners. Make sure you don't clip through your stitching. Move over to the ironing board and press back those seams. First on one side, and then on the other. Once you have all 4 sides pressed back, it's time to flip it the right side out, get out that point turner, and crisp up all those points. There we go. Once it's good, I'm going to go ahead and give it one more final press to really make sure everything's looking good. Move back to my sewing machine, do one more stitch an even amount away from the edge of the fabric, enclosing the hole and just crisping up all edges. And there we have our candy cane coaster completed. It is time to move on to the tree. We're going to use our sewing machine again to stitch around the shape off of the shape that we traced with our tracing paper. We want to make sure that we are actually backstitching at each of the corners, help give it a little bit more security and everything. And once we have it fully traced off, it's time to cut out the inside, leaving just a small seam allowance in there, and clipping into those corners and clipping the other corners off. Then I'm going to move over to my ironing board and press open those seams that are nice and straight and easy to kind of press open. This will help it turn much easier and provide that really crisp line. Once I have those ironed, I'm going to go ahead and use my point turner to help flip everything out so that I have my tree picture completed. And I'm going to give it a few good irons to make sure it is really crisping up. Next, I'm going to move back over to the sewing machine, and it's time to actually add that backing fabric. I'm also going to add just a little bit of ribbon so that I have like a tree trunk underneath my fabric. Just like so. Then I'm going to go ahead and pin the rest of the way around the tree, and I'm going to stitch the shape cutout to that background fabric. And I'm just going to stitch nicely all the way around. You want to maintain the same distance from the edge to keeping it look super professional. And there we have it. We are now going to trim away the excess fabric so that we don't have any extra bulk in there. Then it's time to grab the backing fabric, and with right sides together, we're going to line up the corners, pin it together, and move back over to the sewing machine and sew around the 4 corners, backstitching at each one of the corners, or sew around each one of the 4 sides, backstitching at each one of the corners, making sure that you leave a 2-inch opening of where you can actually flip the coaster right side out. Then we're going to go ahead and clip those corners and move to the ironing board, iron back each one of the sides. Flip it over and iron the other sides back. And once you have all the seam allowances pressed back, it's time to flip it right side out and use that point turner to really crisp up all those points. Once you have all the points ready, it's time to give it one last final press with the iron, move back over to the sewing machine, and do a stitch all the way around the 4 sides, keeping an equal distance away from the edge to keep it looking nice and professional. And there we have the tree completed. We can now add it to the full set of all 4 coasters that we have. And there we have it. We now have 4 really cute festive coasters to put out for our decorations for the Christmas time season. I think my favorite is definitely the present. I just think it came out super, super adorable. If you're enjoying, or if you want to make these patterns, you can find the pattern in the description below. And if you enjoyed this project, don't forget to like and subscribe so that you can see other fun houseware, some accessories, and of course some digital pattern drafting. I look forward to seeing you in some of my other videos. Happy sewing!